This lecture consists of a bit of a review of some recent discussions of essays by Ignacio Correa, as well as a preview of some upcoming essays that we'll be discussing. In particular, the upcoming essay, Is a Different Kind of University Possible? And in this particular talk, I want to provide you with some issues and some questions that I think you should keep in mind when it comes time to offer your reflections on the relationship between philosophy, the university, and liberation. Well, let's start with philosophy. Philosophy is fundamentally about questioning. And really, if you boil it down, philosophy comes down to just two questions: why and what is it really? Now, once you start from there, it gets very complex and very nuanced and very sophisticated very quickly. But at bottom, that's what philosophers are after. That's the quest. Why are things as they are? What are things really? Not how they just seem to be or appear to be, but how are they in reality? And that's what philosophy pursues. Philosophy is also a political endeavor. Remember, we learned that Socrates philosophizes not in spite of being a citizen, but because he's a citizen. He philosophizes because human beings are social and political beings by nature, as you can learn from Aristotle in Book One of the Nicomachean Ethics. We're social beings, and because we are, questions arise, problems arise. We wonder why things are the way they are between us. And we want to know what we are really and how it's best for us to be really. Those are philosophical questions because we're social and political beings. So society is the place of philosophy, and we've been learning that for these thinkers, particularly Correa, and as we'll see, Enrique Dussel, place is all important when it comes to doing philosophy. As Correa says, the choice of place from which to do philosophy is essential to understanding the work of any given philosopher. And generally speaking, society is that place. But if there is, as Zubiri would argue, a necessary diversity of societies and expressions of our social political nature, then there will be different places, and we'll have to choose which place where we will philosophize from. Philosophy is about both the humanization, which is Correa's long word for becoming who you are as an individual, making yourself as agent, actor, and author, as Zubiri would put it, and conscientization, which is his long word for the effort to understand and to build the state or the collective or our communal being together. Just like we have to make our I, we have to make our we as well. Philosophy has a creative function, as we learn, and that is ideology formation. It is fundamentally theoretical. That Greek word theoria, from which we get our word theory, means to see, not with your eyes, but an intellectual seeing. Philosophy helps us to see, if it's done well, what's really going on, and to formulate a vision for how it is best for us to be, what is and what might be. It's fundamentally, though, trying to get a handle on how things are. And, that the effort leads to, what we might think of as the various branches of philosophy, subdivisions of philosophy, you want to say, based on an elaboration of those fundamental why and what is it really questions. For instance, what is truth? What is knowledge? What's genuine knowledge or true knowledge? That's what we call the epistemology, the study of knowledge and truth. What is reality really? Well, that's metaphysics. How is it best for us to be? How's it best for me to be? That's ethics or moral philosophy. What is the optimum social arrangement? That's our political philosophy. And what is the meaning of it all? What is the meaning of reality? That could be considered theology if you understand theology in Zubiri's way of putting it. Now, I just want to note that it appears that neither Correa nor Zubiri were particularly interested in the question of the beautiful. The good and the true, yes. The beautiful doesn't get mentioned as well. And I do want to remind us that the ancients understood the quest to attain the beautiful as related to the quest for order. The Greek word cosm, where we get both cosmos and cosmology and cosmetology, the beauty school, uh, relate to the word for order, the opposite of which is chaos or chaos. And the Greeks thought that if things were in order, if everything was where it was meant to be, everything in the right place, it would be beautiful. And it would be beautiful because things would truly be what they're meant to be. And that would be good. The good, the true, and the beautiful are convertible. In other words, when you're talking about one, you're talking about them all. So I think maybe, although neither Kriya nor Zubiri tends to focus on this question, maybe aesthetics, the quest for genuine beauty, might be related to theology. I don't think that's a bad guess, but I admit that it is a guess. The basic requirements for philosophy's creative function, that trying to see and develop a vision. We learned from an earlier essay that we need a theory of intelligence and of human knowledge. We need an epistemology, and we learn we got to be careful with that, right? Intelligence can liberate; it's necessary for liberation, but it has also been used uh, many times throughout human history to oppress or constrain persons and their freedom. So intelligence is a tool. It's a two-edged sword. I wonder sometimes, and I'll just throw this in here, what Zubiri's ideas of intelligence really come down to, and whether Kriya has fully absorbed those teachings. I would hate to be the one to challenge that view that he fully absorbed them. But there's an idea, especially a modern idea, of reason as being a tool, of being an instrument. In fact, it has a name: instrumental reasoning. That the intellect doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't reveal anything. It's like a tool in your toolbox, like a hammer. Then you could use a hammer to build a house, to give somebody shelter and a home, or you could use a hammer to hit them over the head. You could do good or you could do evil, and the hammer itself doesn't tell you whether you should build houses or hit people over the head. It doesn't say that to you. Uh, that's a view of the intellect that is not shared by Plato. It's not shared by Aristotle. It would not be shared by Thomas Aquinas, the ancients and the medievals. And I I wonder exactly sometimes for myself where Zubiri and Kriya might land on this. Other scholars may think that there's a no-brainer answer to that question, but I find myself questioning that a little bit. Is intelligence merely a tool to be used for good or evil according to the will? Is the intelligence a slave to the will, a slave to the passions, as a David Hume, an empiricist, might say? Or can our intellect connect us with something that can be revelatory for us about who we are and why things are and the meaning of things? Well, it's a question. We need a theory of reality as such to do the creative function of philosophy. That's metaphysics. We must consider, as Kriya urges, both natural and historical reality, objective and subjective reality, social and personal reality. We can't leave anything out. We need an open and critical theory of the human being, of society, and of history. That's fundamentally a philosophical anthropology and a philosophical politics. The creative function requires a theory that provides the rational function for the evaluation of our choices and actions, or to show what limitations there might be to those foundations, and that's ethics or moral philosophy. And then again, we need that reflection on the ultimate and the transcendent, on fundamental meaning. That's a philosophical theology in Zubiri's sense. There's also the critical function of philosophy: disideologization, the doubt and negation, the wonder and the thought that maybe things could be otherwise. It's critical in the sense that it allows us to see the conditions of possibility of the current situation as well as the limits of the current situation. And the critical function does bring in how things might be. Remember, we must always try to make sure we understand how things really are, and then to have a vision of how things might be. Remember, Eukria says that philosophy is polemos, the Greek word for struggle or war. It's both a battle against oneself, a kind of dissatisfaction and a yearning, an idea that we're not finished or settled, but it's also a battle against the powers that be, those that think they know when they don't, as Socrates would say. Philosophy is a vocation, and you can hear the word in vocation, vocal or voice. It's a calling. Something calls us to philosophy, Eukria says. It's a function of human reality, Zubiri would put it, of our relative absoluteness, of the impellence, the push to configure our own I, to mold our relegation, our being bound back to that ground of reality that serves as the foundation of our I and our we. So, and that we mold ourselves both socially and historically. We're driven to that. We can't not do. We're always doing that, like it or no. And philosophy is a calling to that, and that calling requires that we learn its methods. It's to learn logic, to be clear in our reasoning, and to make good efforts at defining and clarifying our ideas so we know what we're talking about. There's many examples that could be given throughout the history of philosophy of philosophers arguing with each other over a word, let's say substance, when they're talking about different things. They're using the same word, but they're defining them differently, and they haven't been clear with each other how they're defining those terms. So it's very important to the philosophical enterprise to be able to be clear about our terms and to define them as best as we're able. So philosophy finally must be both creative and critical to do its job. The worry about it only being creative is that it may come to be enamored with its own findings, its own vision, its own system building, and stand back and marvel at these great intellectual structures that were built, even if they might be missing something. But if philosophy were only critical, if we're only tearing down, we would be blinded. We would not see what might be. We wouldn't have a vision of what would be good or true or beautiful. So how do we philosophize? To remind us again, Eukria says we need to be immersed in reality. We can't start from fantasy land. We need to know how things are beyond appearances. We have to master those technical requirements of philosophy if we're going to be any good at this and hope to get some real results. And we need, as he says, to confront the great thinkers. The great thinkers are great not because they're right. The great thinkers are great because they've given us plenty to consider, plenty to think about. And we want to honor that, not just pick it up and adopt it. Well, Aristotle said it, so it must be true. We don't want to be like that. That's not philosophizing, but being in conversation with an Aristotle or an Augustine or a Kant or a Heidegger or a Sartre or an Eukria or a Zubiri. Help us to think for ourselves, which will be the goal. Now, what about the university's role in this? Eukria says we have certain assumptions here. The site or place for theory, according to him, where we really can theorize, where we can really see, is the situation of the poor majority. Why is that? Because this is where we see false ideology most clearly, and so reality most clearly. When things break down, they break open, and we see that what the powers that be say things are not really the way they are. We don't have the truth. We're not in the truth. So where things break is where you start to have discoveries. And that's an important scientific principle too. Scientists are the good ones are always hoping for a kind of failure where they have a hypothesis that doesn't work out, because then they learn something. But if you guess that something's going to happen and it happens, it might have happened because of your guess, because of why you thought it would, but you don't really know that for sure. When you can falsify a claim, then you got something there. Now you know something. Now that's not going to work. That can't work. Well, it's the same thing here. Like the plight of the poor doesn't necessarily tell us how to fix it, but it does give us that truth. It's not what they say it is. It's not working. At least that's how Eukria sees it. The existence of poor majorities is, quote, a challenge to the ethical conscience of humanity, and specifically a very urgent challenge to the university in the realm of both theory and ethics. And my question to myself and to us is, should this go for us too? Should this be our place? Are we persuaded by his claim that this is where we could see what's going on? Should the university be devoted, and I'm quoting him again now, formally and explicitly to the mission of defending basic human rights of the poor majority? Or is this just a tangential effort, right? So what does that mean? These are the choices he's given us. Either the university's goal, its telos, its final cause, its end or aim or goal or purpose, is to devote itself to basic human rights and to the alleviation of the oppression and repression of the poor majority. That's what it's for. It should use all of its resources for that aim. That's what it's all about. That's the organizing focus of everything we do. That's one option. The other option is, well, the university is for some other purpose. Let's pick one. Knowledge for knowledge's sake. Knowing things just to know things. Or if you want to add something else in, producing workers for the economy as it currently is, whatever that economy is, and however it works, whether it's just or not. And the question of the poor majority, the question of injustice would be tangential to that. In other words, we would have occasional, workshops or seminars or conferences or whatever, where we talk about that as something that maybe we ought to be concerned about, but it's not the main thing. I'm not saying it's not important, but it would not be the main thing. And Eyakuria is saying, well, which is it? Now, his answer is, yes, it's supposed to be formally and explicitly devoted to the mission of basic human rights. Why is that? He says, well, not just because all institutions should work for the common good. And it's not just universities, the government, healthcare, businesses, the family, everything should work for the human good. And that happens to mean working for the poor majority. It's not just that. He says the university, as the theoretical and technical cultivator of truth and knowledge, has a role that goes beyond training competent professionals, as we'll see in some upcoming lectures. He writes in the essay, "The University, Human Rights, and the Poor Majority," which we'll get to, where injustice prevails, it is not only difficult to proclaim the truth, but it's almost impossible to find the truth, which is what a university is about. It's almost impossible to study reality. It's almost impossible to develop knowledge that is true and just where injustice prevails. So we have, as a university, he's arguing, we have to be concerned about injustice, because you can't do what you think a university is supposed to do, which is to seek the truth. If there's a block, a barrier, an obstacle to the truth, and that obstacle being injustice, and so we have to ask: he thought in his country, at his time, in the last third of the 20th century, in a poor nation, run by the capitalist powers that be, he thought they were in a situation of injustice, and that did make doing what universities do very difficult and almost impossible. But what about us? Are we in a situation of justice such that this concern, really doesn't come up for us? We don't need to worry about it. We are free and clear of those obstacles, those blocks or blockades to finding real truth, because we operate in a system of justice. I mean, that's the question. Just what is our situation? Give that a good think. What is our context? What is the horizon against which we try to understand ourselves? There's an ambiguity. Yeah, according to Eyakuria, job one of the university is not just to produce competent professionals, but we have to produce competent professionals, he'll say very clearly. There'll be no mistake about it. He just doesn't think it's the job one. And just give you a parallel to that. If you remember, if you studied Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, what's the big question of the ethics? Happiness. And he says, well, everybody wants to be happy, but people understand happiness differently. They think different things mean happiness. And for instance, one of the things people think that happiness means is pleasure. And Aristotle wants to distinguish pleasure and happiness. He says, look, happiness is not pleasure. And in fact, he says, if you sought pleasure before all else, in other words, you're a hedonist, you will likely end up not happy in Aristotle's sense, the sense of being fulfilled as what it means to be a human person. But he's not saying pleasure is bad. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. and he thinks a happy life will have a lot of pleasure in it. But if you sought pleasure first, you won't get what you really want. Well, that's what he's trying to say here. We'd have to have competent professionals in society. Absolutely. We would be in deep trouble if we didn't have competent professionals. And yes, they will be an elite because of their competence and their knowledge and what they're able to do. There's no question about it. But if we make that job one, there's the problem. The elites come to reinforce the social structure that keeps them elite. You study a course of study, a program, a major that you think is going to lead to a high paying and influential and power wielding job in a system where the powers are used as they are. So the production of elite without anything else, without having some further or more profound goal, just tends to solidify the power structure. And if that power structure is unjust, it solidifies the injustice. Or he says you just end up with a class of what he calls disassociated technocrats. They don't really care one way or what happens. I think you can see some of this in Silicon Valley, where apps are developed not because of any kind of human need, but because we can, and I can get paid for it somehow. So that can happen as well. In addition, the kinds of knowledge developed reinforce the status quo and to marginalize the poor majority. What do we study? What majors do we offer? Where are the funders putting their money in programs in our universities? Think about that. Do a little research. Google, the biggest contributions to your own university, and see what the stipulations were. What was that money to be used for? So there's a tension, he says, between truth and injustice. Truth leads to freedom more than freedom leads to truth, we learned, but they're mutually dependent. You really are never going to have one without the other. Truth seeking must be activated by injustice. Injustice serves to suppress the truth. What's that mean? You should feel the pinch. Injustice should be the pinch that motivates you to seek the truth. Well, this isn't good. This isn't fair. This isn't right. This isn't just. What would be just? What is truth? What is going on here? That should be the motivator. Truth seeking is ultimately futile if it ignores injustice, Eya argues. And again, you need to consider that claim for yourself. Do you agree with that claim? Why, and if you don't, why don't you? Where has he gone wrong? What is he missing here? Dialectics are at work here, right? The social situation demands the university have as its mission the cause of the poor majorities, and its mission is to help the poor theoretically and practically, thus changing the social situation. The social situation of injustice, especially where he is and when he is in the last third of the 20th century in a poor, oppressed nation with a poor majority, that drives the mission of the university. But when the university does its work, it is going to shift the landscape one way or another. It's going to shift it because it will have its successes, and it's going to shift it because there will be renewed resistance to that kind of effort. And here's what he means. I'm quoting him. The question is how to do so. The work theoretically and practically for social justice, how to do so in a society that does not want that to be done, and that not only resists efforts by the university to do so, but demands that it do the opposite, that it continue to harden the social practices that manifest in injustice. Again, what are the pressures on the university to do certain things rather than others, and who benefits from that? And Eya Kriya is a realist. Why wouldn't he be? He's got to be a realist as a Zubirian philosopher. The university cannot ignore those pressures for fear of being abandoned by society. And I wonder, is that happening to us here now? Is society thinking of abandoning higher education in particular? Are there pressures on the kind of questioning that Eya Kriya and Zubiri and Kant and Heidegger and Aquinas and Augustine and Plato and Aristotle all would urge us to undertake, that kind of questioning? Is there pressures to to stop that. Wasn't there a candidate in 2016, an unsuccessful candidate for president, who said we don't need philosophers, we need welders? Are there pressures to get us to stop asking those questions and in effect abandoning the university altogether because it's asking uncomfortable questions? Is the university facing the same fate as Socrates? Not death by hemlock, but death by the end of funding and so forth. Asking those questions, by the way, should not lead you to think that I myself do not think the university has some real issues that it has to deal with in a variety of ways that allow for questioning about what it's doing. I think that's what we're doing here. But there's different kinds of questioning with different kind of motives behind it, and I think we need to keep that in mind. Eacrea points out the bourgeois structure of the university. What he means by that is the underlying structure of the university, his and ours, then and now, is oriented towards the capitalist system. Again, it's that base superstructure model that we talked about with Marx. The way we handle our natural resources, produce goods and services, and distribute them, that's a capitalist model. That model has some few who own the means to production and a large number of the majority who do not, the capitalists and the proletariat. And we learned that the laws and the politics and even the cultural institutions and ideas and art and so forth tend to reinforce that decision, however it got made, to produce and distribute the way we happen to do that. And that would include the university, of course. That would include the university. There'd be no way kind of around that. The question is whether it's set in stone. He writes, indeed, most of those involved in the university, whether students, including their family circle, or professors and administrators, do not feel a profound structural change is urgently needed for the sake of their own interests. Indeed, such change would not bring them great material advantages. Now, he's writing this in El Salvador at the UCA, at the University of Central America, Jose Simeon Cañas in El Salvador. He's writing at the UCA in his time. And even there in his time, the students who walked onto that campus were automatically elite. Their parents who could put them there were automatically elite. Even this new kind of university that was trying out of what Eacrea says a Christian motivation, just standing with the poor majority, the crucified ones of history, as he puts it. Even in that university, the people walking across the campus line were elite. The professors were elite. They were not part of the poor oppressed majority, for the most part. And it is not in their, at least seemingly not in their best interest to make any radical changes because it was good for them. So he's wondering about this. What are you ever going to do when the very setup of the place militates against what ought to be, in Eacrea's view, which is something you need to discuss and think about, when it militates against the very purpose of what a university is for? And what's it for? Find the truth. How do you find the truth? Things are broken. But what if they say, don't look there? Turn your head away. Pay no attention to what's behind that curtain. What happens? How do you do that? And he says, look, even our university, I don't mean ours, I mean his, he's talking now, has little real contact with the oppressed majority that they want to serve because they're not on college campuses. They're fighting for their lives in the farms and fields someplace, in the factories. They're not on campus. So even there's not the requisite contact. It's a problem. He says the knowledge mastered and transmitted does not originate in the needy real world of the bulk of the Salvadoran people, nor is it even neutral and antiseptic. It is generally the watered down knowledge cultivated by dominant countries so that they can remain dominant. What are they teaching in school? What the Americans are interested in, what those values are, what the capitalist values are. Right? That's being taught. It's not like just knowledge for knowledge's sake, a matter of interest. No, it's actually for the majority. Eacrea is arguing that it's pernicious. And again, I think it's worth considering what our status is with all that. He said, I think we mentioned this before. He said it's even, exhibited in the physical plant, which means the buildings and the grounds and the manicured lawns and all that kind of stuff, basically says to the poor majority, this is not for you. And as I like to say, at least in the university where these lectures are being offered, go to the west side of campus, look west, and tell me what those buildings look like, and then stroll over to the east side of campus and look to the east and tell me what those buildings look like, and uh, tell me about where you see, fences and so forth. Just think about that. The UCA, the Universidad Centroamericana Jose Simeon Cañas, is a place with the universal historical crisis of the times uh, is most clearly manifested, according to Aya Korea. It had, in his mind, world historical prominence, a tiny little country with the vast majority impoverished under the boot heel of, capitalism and American dominance. And the U.S., knew that they had to keep control for the U.S. interests, and they spent vast sums of money at the time trying to disrupt any efforts at social change, as we learned. He says now, this university can't be impartial. You got to be objective, and we need to be free, but being objective sometimes demands that you take sides. Objectively, there's injustice being done, and you ought to take this side of the victims. The preferential option, the choosing of solidarity with, and the commitment to the poor. That's, you got to be partial to that. You got to take sides for that, and at least as Aya Korea says, that's what he means by the Christian character of the UCA. Not that it depends upon theological doctrines of the Trinity or theological doctrines of transubstantiation or of the in the Eucharist, any of those theological ideas. He says that, okay, that's not what I'm talking about. What really is the Christian character of the university? As he said before, what really is the Christian character of philosophy is that taking the preferential option for the poor, standing at the foot of the cross with the crucified ones of history. That's taking sides, but it's not being merely subjective. It's not, in his view, it's not just flipping a coin and taking a side just because you feel like it or that's where your friends are. He says objectively, that's what you have to do. That's his argument, and that's the argument I want you to ponder, whether you're in agreement with that. He says, this is how our university works in a revolutionary fashion for the cause of liberation in El Salvador, in a university manner. Again, not as a political party, not as a paramilitary force or anything like that, but by teaching, research, and publication, all those things universities do. We want to accompany a process led primarily by the masses, who, by the way, may not be activated, may not be on the move. That's a question too. And he says, we want to accompany them maybe in a partial and an imperfect way, right? He says philosophy can't solve all the problems. University can't solve all the problems. It's got to play a role. And we wish to do so out of a Christian inspiration, which regards a preferential option for the historic cause of the poor as obligatory. He thinks as Christians, we cannot, stand aside and let that continue and still be able to do what we do as philosophers and as a university. As we learn, UCA plays an active role in that struggle. It has to play its role, as I said, as a university, not as something else. That doesn't mean just training professionals, although that's important. The UCA contribution to the struggle would be to create a body of thought and models and proposals for negotiation. That's what research and teaching does, give us alternatives, help us to see what's happening. It must be honest and objective in the struggle. It must be free and independent in the struggle. And he says it requires a great deal of courage in a country where the weapons of death are fired too often in a very threatening proximity. As we've heard this before. He gave this talk for where that quote came from on November 6, 1989. And 10 days later, he was assassinated by US-backed government forces right on campus, taken right out of his home. Now, finally, the question of liberation. Does philosophy in the university serve the prevailing order or threaten the prevailing order? Which do you think? Another question, is philosophy and its embodiment in the university? And I probably haven't stress this, how important philosophy is to the core of what a university is. A lot of times you think, oh, philosophy, that's that. I got to take required courses in that, but my major is over here. It's on the side. It's tangential. But think about all those professors you have with their PhDs. You know what that PhD stands for, don't you? Doctor of Philosophy, right? A seeking of wisdom in a certain area. Doctor of Philosophy in economics or in politics or in biology or in physics. PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. Philosophy is not one more discipline among others. I know it looks like that. I know that's how we treat it, and that's a pretty good question. Is philosophy in need of liberation? Does it need to be liberated from this idea that it's another discipline, that it's supposed to be disciplined, locked up, where it can do no harm? Is that what it's supposed to be? Because its questions are threatening, or should it be about serving the prevailing order? Well, that's it. Is philosophy and its embodiment in the university a principle of ideologization, or is it a principle of disideologization? A. Kriya writes in the What is the Point of Philosophy? Philosophy as the search for the fullness of truth, not the mere absence of error, but the full presence of reality, is thus an indispensable element in the integral liberation of our peoples. When these peoples count on the real possibility of thinking for themselves in all the orders of thought, everywhere we have to think, from the mundane to the most speculative, right? They will take the path of liberty and a full possession of themselves. Self-possession is the core, the essence of personhood. He said, that's what philosophy is for. To take self-possession, to think for yourself, to be a person, be what you are. Now, I've probably alluded to this, and I wanted to make sure we got these passages in front of us. This comes from Immanuel Kant, 1784 article, entitled An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? Because I think A. Kriya has some of this in mind when he's writing too. So we hear about the Enlightenment, a period of history and of thought and culture. What is that? What does that mean, enlightenment, in the Western philosophical tradition anyway? Well, Kant says, I got an answer for you. Enlightenment is man's or human's emergence from his or her self-imposed immaturity. Emergence from immaturity, self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment. And he goes on, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a proportion of people, long after nature has released them from alien guidance, the guidance of others, nonetheless gladly remain in lifelong immaturity, and why it is so easy for others to establish themselves as our guardians. It is so easy to be immature. If I have a book to serve as my understanding, a pastor to serve as my conscience, a physician to determine my diet for me, and so on, I need not exert myself at all. I need not think, if only I can pay. Others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. The guardians, who have so benevolently taken over the supervision of men, have carefully seen to it that the far greatest part of them, us, including the entire fair sex, that's women, regard taking the step to maturity, think for yourself, as very dangerous, not to mention difficult. Having first made their domestic livestock dumb, those guardians of us, think of us as cattle, think of us as sheep, and they made us dumb. And having carefully made sure that we, docile, timid, tame creatures, will not take a single step without the go-kart to which they're harnessed, which is their, wisdom and elite guardianship. These guardians then show us the danger that threatens us should we attempt to walk alone. Oh, look at Socrates, for example. Look what happened. He started to think for himself, and what did that get him? Got him the hemlock, right? You don't want that to happen to you. There you go, thinking again. President Reagan used to say, there you go, thinking again. Now, this danger of thinking for yourself. And there might be, you might make mistakes, you might make some errors. He says, now this danger is not actually so great, not that big. For after falling a few times, we would, in the end, certainly learn to walk. We certainly learn to think for ourselves. But an example of problems of this kind makes us timid and usually frightens us out of all further attempts. Thus, it is difficult for any individual person to work himself or herself out of the immaturity that has all but become our nature. Now, that's what Kant was worried about at the end of the 18th century, that people needed to start to think for themselves, but we don't want to. It's so easy not to think for ourselves. It's so easy to be immature, as Kant defines it. Uh, what about us now? Do we think for ourselves? Are we willing to think for ourselves? Are we willing to support institutions that help us and urge us to think for ourselves? So, some final questions here for you. What is philosophy for? Is it, for us here now, doing what it's supposed to be doing here where we are? Are we ideologizing, me and you, or the university and your programs? Are we disideologizing, or both? How could we philosophize differently? Is there some other way to do it? And who's this university for? To whom should it answer? Whose interests are being served? Whom should it serve? Think about it. Are we here now, us, me and you, this university, this community, this nation, are we now in need of liberation? And if so, how can the university help us with that? And if not, if we're not in need of liberation, that's what we think, then do we owe anything to those in need of liberation? And how can the university, and how can, in particular, philosophy, help them? Should it help them? Can it help them? What's our hermeneutical situation? In other words, what's the horizon against which we come to understand ourselves? Remember, hermeneutics, the practice of interpretation, demands that we understand that everything we think in a context. Everything we think against a horizon or a screen, without which we couldn't think anything. But if the screen were to change, so would the meanings of our ideas and our values. So what is the horizon against which we come to understand ourselves? And to use A.A. Kriya's important way of looking at things, how would we, me and you, this university, this community, how would we realize the weight of reality, perform that noetic or theoretic function of seeing what's really going on? How would we really do that? And then what would it take for us to shoulder the weight of reality, to feel the pinch, to stand accused by what's going on, the ethical moment of our encounter with reality. And then finally, how would we take charge of the weight of reality? How would we be responsible for what's really going on? Responsible, able to respond. How can we enable ourselves to respond to what's really going on? Well, these are questions that I have for myself, questions I have for you, and I hope that you will consider them in our upcoming discussions and forums. Think through these questions in the light of things that we've learned. Think through them in the light of your own experience as a student, as a member of our university community, as a citizen of whatever nation that you're a citizen of, not necessarily a U.S. citizen. And let's think about these things together as best as we can.